John chapter 21. What I've entitled the message this morning is Moving Beyond Our Failure. Moving Beyond Our Failure. It's hard to believe that we've already gone through the entire book of John. In John chapter 19, a couple weeks ago, we talked about the suffering of Jesus, how he suffered for each and every one of us, along with his death and his burial. In John chapter 20, we witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus revealed himself on 3 different occasions. Number 1, we see him at the tomb with Mary, and her heart is filled with sorrow. She goes to the tomb, and the stone has been rolled away. She sees someone, and she thinks that someone is the gardener. And she said, "Sir, where have you placed his body?" "I came to lay flowers on his grave. Where have you placed his body?" It is here that Jesus calls her Mary. And as soon as he called her Mary, she knew that it was Jesus. And she begins to cling to him. Secondly, Jesus revealed himself to the disciples, and they're locked behind closed doors. Now you've got to understand how these men are feeling. They're defeated. This was the same day that Mary had seen him. He showed the disciples the nail prints in his hand, the nail prints in his feet, how he was pierced in his side. Thomas wasn't with the disciples on this visit. And when they told Thomas that Jesus was alive, Thomas doubted. Thomas didn't believe. 8 days later, Jesus appeared to the disciples again, and this time Thomas is present. As we get to John chapter 21, the disciples at this time, they all know that Jesus is alive. He's well. But they all feel like complete failures, because when Jesus needed them the most, they failed. They blew it. They scattered and they fled. And as we look at John chapter 21, we see Jesus interacting with the 7 disciples. Now this interaction time is very, very critical, because these men have not backed up from their previous failure. They still feel like failures in the eyes of the Lord. You know, when most people speak on John chapter 21, they don't speak on the entire chapter. But they start with verse 15. Turn to verse 15 with me, where Jesus is asking Peter the question, "Peter, do you love me?" Now Jesus asked Peter 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" Let's look at John 21, verses 15 through 17. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He's asking him a question. "Yes, Lord," Peter replied, "you know that I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. Verse 17, a third time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus looked at him and he said, "Then feed my sheep." The question that I want to propose to you this morning is, why did Jesus ask Peter the question 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" When Jesus asked Peter the question, "Do you love me?" the word that Jesus was using for love here, when he says, "Peter, do you love me?" the Greek word that he was using is agape. "Peter, do you have the deepest form of love for me?" That's the love of God that never fails. But when Peter answered the question, and he said, "Lord, you know that I love you," the word that Peter used for love is phileo. That is a friendship love, a brotherly love. Peter was looking at Jesus, and Peter was saying to Jesus, "You know, Lord, that I have a deep affection for you." You know that I have a special place in my heart for you. But at this point, he could not say, I agape you. There are some who say that Jesus asked Peter if he loved him 3 times because Peter denied Jesus 3 times. I've heard that preached before. To me, this doesn't sound like Jesus. Hey, Peter, since you denied me on 3 separate occasions, I'm going to ask you on 3 separate occasions if you really love me. I would like to suggest that there is something deeper that is taking place here. John is letting us know in John chapter 21 that something very, very deep is taking place. Let me give you an illustration. If I came home from work and Gail greeted me at the door and said, Carl, do you love me? I would say, sure I do, Gail. What's for dinner? But a few moments later, she asked me the question again, Carl, do you really love me? I would look at her and say, you know I love you, sweetheart. I hold your hand on occasion. We live in the same house. We have children together. Your last name is Kelleher. We watch Hallmark movies together. But the 3rd time she would ask the question, Carl, I really need to know, do you really love me? Most guys, by the 3rd time, would know that something deeper is taking place. Jesus is asking Peter the question, do you love me, Peter? He knows the answer because he's God. But he's asking him, Peter, do you really love me? And this is what Jesus is saying to Peter. Are you committed to me, Peter? Can I depend upon you, Peter? Peter, do I have your entire devotion? I'm convinced that this is what's taking place. Peter loved Jesus, but he was convinced that God could never, ever use him again. I want you to think with me this morning, and I want you to put yourself in Peter's place this morning. Peter felt like he was damaged goods. He had his shot when Jesus needed him the most, and he blew it. Peter is being very, very hard on himself because, see, Peter can't see beyond his failure. Look at John 21 and verse 1. I had to underline this first phrase. After these things. I underlined that. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And in this way he showed himself. After these things, after the resurrection, after Jesus revealed himself to Mary, after Jesus revealed himself to his disciples, Jesus is showing up one more time. Look at verse 4. This is the 3rd time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. This is the 3rd time that the disciples had seen Jesus after the resurrection. But you have to wonder what is going through their minds, especially the mind of Peter, Simon Peter. I'm going to ask you a question. Don't raise your hand and confess. But have you ever really blown it? And then you had to face that person a few days later? You didn't really want to see them. And when you saw that person, you were thinking the entire time, this person must think that I am a complete failure. I just blew it. And yeah, I'm in their presence, and yeah, Jesus is alive. But what does Jesus think about me now? The night that Jesus was betrayed, Jesus told Peter that it was going to happen. But Peter was so overconfident that he looked at Jesus, and he was very sincere. And he looked at all the other disciples, and he said, they might fail you, Jesus, but you don't have to worry about me. I'm the one who stepped out of the boat. I'm the one who walked on the water. I'm the first one who realized that you are the Christ. You're the Son of God. But Peter didn't just deny him one time. Peter denied him 3 times. And after he denied him 3 times, he cursed. He cursed because he wanted everybody to know, hey, I'm not a follower of Jesus. Peter didn't feel like God could ever use him again. It's hard for Peter to see into the future because he can't see beyond his failure. See, it's hard for many of us to see into the future because many times we can't see beyond the future because we're still beating ourselves up because of our failures. And some of you, under the sound of my voice right now, you can't see the things that God has in store for you because you can't get beyond your mess. Have you ever been there? Even in church, and we say the phrases, hey, God loves you with an everlasting love, and God will never stop loving you. But in our minds, we can't get beyond our mess. We feel like a complete failure. You know that God is good. But how can God love you after what you did to him? See, that's what's going through the mind of Simon Peter. You know all of the things that you have done. You know the things that even right now that you're still struggling with. Can we be honest this morning? I believe in immediate sanctification. But I've been saved a long time and God's still working on me. And none of us in this building have arrived. Can you say amen? We're still a work in process. Peter was feeling like such a failure that Peter decided to go back to fishing. Look at verse 3. Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we're going with you also. They went out and immediately got into, this is so important right here. They went out and immediately got into the boat. It doesn't say a boat. This is so important. It says they got into the boat. And that night they caught absolutely nothing. This is too good for us to miss. Peter knows that Jesus is alive. He has witnessed the resurrection. And he's excited about the fact that Jesus is alive. But he still feels like a complete failure. He knows what he did to Jesus. He knows that when Jesus needed him the most, he blew it. He denied Jesus. And see, the enemy is still using that against him, and it's just battling his mind. I can see Peter as he's fishing in his boat. But the Bible says that night they caught absolutely nothing. For those of you that enjoy fishing, when you go fishing and the fish are not biting, you've got a whole lot of time to think. And they're fishing all night long and they are catching nothing. I think that his mind began to go back to another time that he was fishing and he caught nothing. In Luke chapter 5, Peter was fishing. An earlier time in Peter's life, and he caught nothing. He started to put his nets up because he had fished all night and caught nothing. And Jesus said to him, Peter, launch out into the deep. When Peter did what Jesus told him to do, his nets began to supernaturally fill up. There were so many fish in the nets, they had to get another boat to assist them. And when they put the fish in the two boats, the boats literally began to sink because they were catching so many fish. And it was here in Luke chapter 5 that Peter fell at the feet of Jesus, and he knew that he was in the presence of God. He told Jesus, I love Luke 5. He said, depart from me. I'm a sinful man. And Jesus looked at Peter and he said, Peter, don't be afraid. But from now on, you're not going to just fish for fish. But I'm going to make you a fisher of men. And it was that moment that Peter left everything. He sold his boat. He walked away from everything to follow after Jesus. Do you know what's happening in verse 3 of John chapter 21? When Peter gets into the boat, he's quitting because he doesn't feel like he's worthy to be a follower of Jesus Christ. Can I tell you what? There were times when I was growing up in church as an 18-year-old kid that I felt like quitting. The enemy was playing with my mind and playing with my emotions, telling me, hey, you're nothing but a screw-up. You're a loser. You'll never amount to anything. And the devil was playing with my mind. And I'm thinking, God, if that's your image of me, then I might as well quit right now. But the devil is a liar. Can you say amen? He's quitting because he doesn't feel like he's worthy to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And not only is he quitting, but he's taking other people with him. Here's the tragedy of quitting. It doesn't just affect you, but it affects other people as well. When Peter decided to leave the ministry because he didn't feel like he was worthy any longer, and to go fishing, he took other people with him. Look at verse 4 and 5. But when the morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore. I love this. Yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, I love this. Children, have you any food? And the disciples answered him, no. See, I love this part of the story. These men felt like complete failures. They thought they were no longer worthy to be disciples, so they decided to go back to fishing. They thought they were good at fishing. They convinced themselves that they were poor disciples, so they go back to their old profession. They're going to start fishing again. So they go back to their old profession, and even their old profession, they don't feel like they're very good at their old profession because they weren't being very successful. All of a sudden, the man from the shore shouts out, hey guys, are you having any luck? At this time, they don't recognize that it's Jesus, and they say, no, these men are frustrated fishermen. See, I've been out on the lake many, many times, and as you go up and down the lake, and as you see anybody, sometimes you'll yell to the boat next to you, hey guys, are you having any luck? This is exactly what Jesus is doing. He's on the shore, and he said, hey guys, are you having any luck? What you think with me? I think sometimes, in the midst of our frustration, Jesus calls out to us and he says, how are things going? Are you having any luck? But many times the world doesn't always recognize that it's Jesus. And I can almost see Jesus saying to some people right now, how is life going for you? Is it bringing you the joy and the satisfaction that you thought that it would bring? Hey, how is that new job going for you that you thought it was going to be the answer to everything? Is it giving you all of the fulfillment that you thought that you would find in that new job? Hey, how is that new relationship working out for you? Is it everything that you thought that it would be? Now, Jesus is not being a smart aleck right here. Because he's God, he already knew the answer. But he wanted them to acknowledge the fact, nobody, we're not catching anything. Our nets are pretty empty. In the midst of their frustration, I love this, Jesus offered them a simple solution. Look at verse 6. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. They didn't know at this moment that the man on the shore was Jesus. But when they cast their net on the right side of the boat, all of a sudden their nets began to supernaturally fill up, and their nets were so full of fish that they were not able to draw them in. You know what's happening here? Jesus is taking them back to a time in Luke chapter 5 where once again they were fishing and they were catching nothing. And Jesus said, Peter, cast the net to the deep. It was here that Peter had an encounter with God. He knows that Jesus is more than just a good teacher and more than just a prophet and more than just a man. It was here that Peter made a commitment to Jesus Christ. He sold his boat, and from that day forward, he says, I'm going to become a disciple of Jesus. I'm going to become a fisher of men. I want to ask you a question. Do you remember a time in your life where you had an encounter with God? See, I don't want you just to come to church on a Sunday morning and hear a message and sing 2 or 3 songs. We desire on a Sunday morning to create an atmosphere where you and I can have an experience with Almighty God, because when you have an experience with God, there's nothing out there. But do you remember in your life when you had an encounter with God, you knew it was real? You knew that God had a plan, and you knew that God had a purpose for your life? When we begin to feel like failures, hear me, it clouds our minds and gives us a distorted image of the future. Let me say that one more time. When we begin to feel like failures, it clouds our minds and gives us a distorted image of the future. We think because we failed that God could never use us again. And some of you that are sitting under my voice this morning, you know, the enemy's playing with your mind and he's playing with your emotions. We think because we failed, we're failures. No, you might have failed, but you're not a failure. And you need to recognize that. And just because maybe you failed or I failed does not mean that God washes his hands and says, I'm done with you. Look at verse 7. Therefore, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. Now, when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it. I love this. This is just like Peter. And he plunged into the sea. Peter puts a little more clothes on. He jumps into the water. He doesn't wait for the boat to get to the shore. But isn't this just like Simon Peter? He jumps off the boat, and I can see him in my mind's eye as he's running to Jesus. He races to the shore to get to Jesus. Here's my question. How is Jesus going to respond to Peter? A man that denied him 3 times. How is Jesus going to respond to Simon Peter, a man that blew it? How does Jesus interact with someone who has failed him miserably? Look at verses 10 through 13. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish which you have just caught. And they caught fish because he told them what to do. Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the net was not broken. Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. Now I want you to recognize that these men all blew it. It wasn't just Peter that blew it. All the disciples basically blew it, because when Jesus needed them, they all scattered and they fled. So how does Jesus interact with someone who failed him? Church, this is so important, because this is the way that we need to interact with people that fail. Number one, he fellowshiped with them. He fellowshiped with them. I think a lot of times when we blow it and when we fail, the enemy is playing with our minds, and we're thinking, God doesn't want to have anything to do with me because I'm really screwing things up. No, he fellowshiped with them, because he knew that the people sometimes that need fellowship the most are those that feel like they deserve it the least. Number two, I love this one. He did not bring up their past failures. Every one of us in this room have failed God at one point or another. Can you say amen? Amen. The people that I have a tough time with are the self-righteous Christians that they feel like they're God's gift to the world, and they feel like they never fail. I don't want to hang around that individual because I can't relate to that individual, but I can sure relate to Peter, and I can relate to the disciples that all blew it. Hear what I'm about to say. Our failures do not have to define us. See, there's a lot of us, if we're not careful, we allow our failures to define us. And our failures do not have to define us. As Peter and Jesus are eating breakfast together, Jesus asked Peter a question. This is where we get to verse 15. Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Jesus was basically saying, Peter, do you love me more than fishing? Peter, do you love me more than your personal comfort? Peter, do you love me more than your ambition? Or Peter, do you love me more than money? Do you know what Jesus was saying to Peter? He was saying this. Your failure, this is so rich. Your failure does not have to be an indicator of your future. Your failure, Peter, does not have to be an indicator of your future. Peter, if you love me, I'm asking you to do three things. Feed my little lambs. See, that's why I believe in a strong children's ministry. Hey, Pastor, if you really love me, take care of the little lambs. Number two, got to watch the wording here. He said, tend to my sheep. I said this to somebody not long ago. There's a difference between a preacher and a pastor. A preacher just makes his living by preaching. A pastor is somebody that watches over the flock, that cares about the flock. Can I tell you, if you leave for the weekend or if you're not going to be here, call your pastor. Don't make him wonder, hey, what's happened to him this week? See, it's easy for you to call me instead of me to call 250 other people. Because a true pastor is concerned about his flock. And then number three, he said, feed my sheep. If there's one thing here I want to do at Trinity, and I believe God's going to build this church, and he already is building this church. And this is one thing that I'm called to do, and that's feed the sheep. I don't want to give you hamburger helper on Sunday morning. I want to give you ribeye steak. That when you come to church on a Sunday morning, you know that the pastor has spent time in the presence of Almighty God. And he's going to feed the sheep. So what does God want us to take home today? Number one, Jesus is asking us, do you love me enough to do what I'm asking you to do? Anybody can say that they love Jesus. But do you love me enough to do what I'm asking you to do. You can shout, you can yell, you can scream, you can tell everybody how holy you are. But do you love him enough to do what he's asking you to do? Number two, the failures of your past do not need to define you. Jesus didn't die for perfect people. He died for people that were miserable failures. And if you ever feel like, man, I really don't belong to the church because I'm not good enough, Jesus died for you. I love Jesus more than anything in the world, but I'm still trying to get my act together. So the failures of your past do not need to define you. There are some of you that are under the sound of my voice right now. You're beating yourself up because of the past. The past is the past if you put it under the blood of Jesus. Leave it in the past. Number three, God often speaks to us during our times of frustration and emptiness. They fished all night and they caught absolutely nothing. Their nets were completely empty. They were frustrated. And that's when Jesus said, hey boys, how's the fishing going? He knew exactly how it was going. They were frustrated. And some of you right now, under the sound of my voice, you're frustrated with life. You're frustrated with your family. You're frustrated with your work. You're frustrated with life. And Jesus is shouting to you, how's it going? Number four, when you feel like quitting, it doesn't just affect us, but it affects other people. Other people follow. Don't raise your hand. But I think there has been many times in our lives where we just felt like throwing in the towel. But when you quit or I quit, other people watch you and they're going to be affected by you. So be careful. Number five, sometimes during our times of our greatest struggle, we just need a fresh encounter with God. Some of you right now, you're frustrated. You're frustrated with this thing called life, and life can frustrate you very easily. But in your frustration, Jesus comes to you and says, hey, remember this time? Some of you, under the sound of my voice this morning, you're frustrated with life. And you just need an encounter with God this morning. Number six, in spite of our failures, sometimes we just need to jump out of the boat and run to Jesus. Peter knew that the last time that he really had an encounter with Jesus, he betrayed him, he denied him, he cussed. He cussed. He wasn't there when Jesus was there. And all of a sudden, he realizes that it's Jesus in spite of his failure, in spite of his shortcoming. He jumps over the side of the boat. And I mean, have you ever seen anybody run in the water, run in the ocean? I mean, they have to really pick him up. And Peter is running to Jesus. Some of you, Jesus is saying, I see your frustration. Run to me, because I'm calling your voice this morning. Number seven, when we see ourselves as failures, it clouds our thinking, and it gives us a distorted image of the future. Sunday after church is over, and Monday is one of the hardest times in the world for a pastor. You know, a lot of pastors resign on Monday. When we see our failures, it clouds our thinking, and it gives us a distorted image of the future. Some of you right now, not seeing your future the way God sees your future. Because you're not seeing yourself the way your Father sees you. Let me shout it from behind this pulpit. You are not a failure. You are a child of Almighty God. And in spite of your faults and in spite of your flaws, He loves you with an everlasting love. Number 8. When we feel like we have blown it, God doesn't push us away. But He says to us, let's have a meal together. Is that not rich? When you feel like the biggest bum and the biggest loser, and the enemy's playing with your mind, and you're feeling like, hey, I'm not even worthy. When you feel like you have blown it, God doesn't push us away, but He says, let's have a meal together. I'll never forget, I'm probably 23 years old at the time. I had just seen several young men go to prison. I went to court that day, and several young men went to prison because they were involved in things they shouldn't be involved in. And I went back to the Assembly of God church there in Fisk, Missouri. And I said, hey, we need to do something for the young people in our town. Who will help me? It was a Sunday night. Nobody raised their hand. I just saw several young men go to prison. And I'm thinking if the church was involved in the community, maybe this would not have happened. I said, hey, we need to do something for the young people in our community. Who will help me? Nobody raised their hand. I'm 23 years old, probably at the time. Have a whole lot of zeal, but very little wisdom. I had a piece of paper in my hand with a plan, and nobody raised their hand. So I, being God's man of faith and power and being so spiritual, I wanted the piece of paper up in front of all of them. And I said, we might as well let them go to hell. That wasn't the best thing to say. All of a sudden, my piano player says, what a baby thing to say. All of a sudden, the Holy Spirit's dealing with me. And He says, Kelleher, if you don't deal with this one real quick, you're going to be in some serious trouble. I blew it. A man came to me after the church service was over, and he says, I just want you to know, you really blew it today, Pastor. And I'm thinking, thank you, my brother. Thank you for sharing that with me. I wouldn't have known that unless you shared that with me. But let me say this. All of us have blown it. And I want to be a church that when we do blow it, we don't retreat from one another. But we say, let's have a meal together. Because with God's help, we can get past this. Would you say amen? Amen. Would you stand with me this morning, please?